Hello, and thanks for tuning in for another session of Back Porch Catechetics, Office Edition. This short video is focused on an explanation of the Synoptic Problem, a phrase that New Testament scholars and other theologians often use as a shorthand to reflect on a problem we see when reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels side by side. There are different ways of counting or measuring the problem, which is really a problem of similarity between the three Gospels. An article published in 1968 by a scholar with the last name Honoré gave a statistical analysis by individual word in the Greek. And I'll use that as the basis. There are other ways of counting the problem or trying to measure it. Instead of individual words in Greek, we could try individual words in an English translation, for example. We might go phrase by phrase instead of individual word by word, or we might go story by story instead of phrase by phrase. We have to make a decision whether a grammatical word like and counts as part of our similarity or whether we should toss that out. We have to make a decision about whether a pronoun or a proper name would count. Jesus did this or he did that. Is that overlap? Is that similarity or not? Now, obviously, different decisions at that level will yield different results in the particular word count or way that we might measure the problem. But regardless of what decisions we make, we end up with something very similar in the final analysis. So I'll display a chart based on the word count method and the decisions that Honoré made in his 1968 article. But any way you count it, you're going to come up with something like 3/4 of Mark's Gospel is repeated in Matthew and Luke. More than 90% of Mark is repeated in Matthew. That accounts for more than half of Matthew. Matthew's Gospel's longer than Mark's. In Luke's Gospel, the parts of Mark that are used account for a little over 40% of Luke's Gospel. Consider the thought experiment. Imagine Matthew, Mark, and Luke are undergraduate students of mine, and they submit their Gospels as the final project for the course, their paper. Now, that's going to go through our digital servers, our software is going to calculate it, it's going to pop back up in big red letters. Dr. Humphreys, you've got a problem here. It's going to tell me that more than 90% of Mark's paper is virtually identical to Matthew and Luke. It's going to tell me half of Matthew's work can be found in Mark. It's also going to tell me that another 1/4 of Matthew and Luke agree with each other, but Mark doesn't know anything about that. In short, the software is going to say these are not independent papers. They definitely have a relationship. And before I can respond to their work and before I can definitely assign a grade, I'm going to have to sit down with the three of them and figure out what happened. Did they all three get together and kind of write their papers together? Did 2 of them work on a draft and then they shared that draft with a third? Did one of them write a paper and the other 2 stole it and worked on it independently? I'm going to have to do some investigative work to figure out how these things are related. Now, the problem is going to get even more complicated when I call these 3 students into my office to ask them, what's going on with your paper? Because they're obviously going to say, well, look, Dr. Humphreys, you assigned a book. We all read the same book. Of course, we'd all come up with the same basic plan. And then it's going to be even more complicated when they remind me that I've been lecturing on that book for several weeks in class. And so they have a common shared experience of the way I've explained it. Surely that shaped their similarity. In today's language, I'm going to be figuring out a problem of plagiarism and sources. Which of the sources are me and my verbal spoken words in class? Which of the sources are the papers and books that I assigned for my students to read? And which of it was them getting together outside of class, perhaps even cheating on their final papers? Now, if we return to our analysis of the 1st and 2nd century texts, the ones that we recognize as the Gospels, we immediately see the problem. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar, even to the point of sharing identical words and phrases, technical terms, and order of presentation of the material, that we have to ask, what's the relationship between them? Now, all 3 are trying to relate the inspired good news of Jesus Christ. They are intentionally doing similar projects. We expect similar results. So we have to sort through when they might be reflecting on the same experience that they would have all had of the incarnate Christ himself or the risen Christ later, when they might be relating the same stories that they've heard from other disciples, when they might be reading each other's work, and when they might be reflecting on their own experience independently. The synoptic problem is that the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are clearly related, but we do not know how. Sometimes when we hear the word problem concerning when we read the Gospels, sacred scripture, we're tempted to think that this means we have a problem with inspiration, or a problem with faith, or a problem with the tradition. I don't think that's the case here, but I do see why it worries some people. It seems to me possible to recognize an intellectual problem of the form, how do I explain how this happened? Without letting that intellectual problem damage the relationship I have with God through faith, hope, and love. Just because I cannot explain it, or just because two other people differ on how to explain it, does not mean that it did not happen, does not mean that these are not inspired Gospels, that they genuinely connect us to God. In fact, while it is challenging, I think the synoptic problem can help me grow intellectually and spiritually without having to set faith and reason in opposition. The Gospels certainly deserve prayerful study.